During the American Revolution, the British Army under General Cornwallis surrendered to American forces and their French allies at Yorktown in 1781. This was a devastating defeat for the British, and it soon became clear to the colonists and the Europeans alike that the Americans were going to win the war. However, the fighting would continue for another 2 years. In fact, the war would escalate to a global scale. The French, Spanish, and Dutch helped the Americans dominate the fighting by supplying naval support and weapons. The British continued to suffer a series of humiliating defeats, not only in the colonies, but also in the Mediterranean, the West Indies, Africa, and Asia. Finally, protests from English citizens, merchants, and politicians forced parliamentary officials to the table. In September of 1783, 3 American diplomats, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, met with British representatives in France to conclude the war officially. The Treaty of Paris granted the United States its independence. The British ceded all the lands south of Canada, east of the Mississippi, and north of Spanish-owned Florida to the Americans. From 1775 to 1783, Americans had fought for their independence from the British. When the war began, few Europeans believed the Americans would win. With the Treaty of Paris, the Americans had won their independence, and after 8 long years of violence and deprivation, the American Revolution was finally over.
Next year, as you well know, we here in the United States will be marking and celebrating the semi-quincentennial of the ratification of the instrument of the proclamation of our independence as a sovereign agglomeration of states. And while it is good and proper that we should do so, we would not be marking that anniversary if the issuance of that instrument of that proclamation not been accompanied first by decisive victory on the fields of battle, which we achieved at Yorktown on 19 October 1781, and second by the successful conclusion of the diplomatic instrument that brought an end to the official state of armed hostility and enshrined in international law our station as an independent political entity unto ourselves. And it's with this in mind that today we mark, though 1 day late because the actual day was yesterday, the 242nd anniversary of the Treaty of Paris, Article 1 of which remains the world's oldest peace treaty that is still fully in force and not superseded by any subsequent treaty, even in spite of that brief little hiccup 30 years later that we now call the War of 1812. It's Thursday, the 4th of September. This is Curmudgeon's Corner. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where it's 32 years ago today that Lady Curmudgeon agreed to take me on and thus marry well below her station. Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to Curmudgeon's Corner. Let's talk about what high-speed internet looked like in the latter part of the 18th century. In our current day and age, when you want to have a diplomatic conference, you make the invitation by telephone or email, you jump on an airplane, and depending on the urgency of the situation, all the concerned parties can be sitting at the same table within a matter of 24 hours or less. But things moved a bit more glacially back in the days of the American Revolution. Military commanders, especially on the British side, had to be given a certain amount of latitude and autonomy, since if you had a question you wanted to ask of the king or the prime minister back home, you had to write a letter, then place it in the hands of a messenger, then put the messenger on your fastest warship, allow the ship 4 to 6 weeks to make the Atlantic crossing, best case scenario, depending on how favorable the trade winds are. Then you allow the messenger 2 or 3 days to make the carriage ride from Portsmouth to London, then another 2 or 3 days to make the carriage ride back from London to Portsmouth, then let's say 6 to 8 weeks to make the return voyage back across the Atlantic, since you've got a headwind instead of a tailwind now, after all. And you've got the answer to your question, if everything goes just as quickly as possible, in about a third of a year before you're receiving your answer. So when Cornwallis can see that he has been defeated at Yorktown, he doesn't really have the option of sending a cable to his bosses back in London asking if he should surrender to the rebel commander, or George Washington Esquire, as they liked to call him back then, since to call him General Washington would have been to implicitly confer recognition upon the United States, so we can't do that. To which General Washington said, fine, if you want to play little semantic games, then I will not accept your surrender. I won't even consider your terms, and we can go right on fighting until your entire army is dead. And our friends in the French Navy, they are more than happy to wait around and deny you the ability to escape by sea. So then they decided to start calling him General Washington. Funny how that happens. The point being, if you ever wondered back in school when you were learning the history of the Revolution, as I know I wondered, wait, if the decisive battle ended in the fall of 1781, how come it took until the summer of 1783 to dot the I's and cross the T's on the peace settlement? Well, that is why. Getting some people into a room to talk about a thing was a logistical challenge the likes of which we can scarcely imagine here in the age of light-speed communication and international jet travel. And moreover, it wasn't just a treaty being concluded between the United Kingdom and the United States. We had 3 other allied nations who had helped us gain our victory, and thus they all had skin in the game too, the French, the Dutch, and the Spaniards. So naturally, they each wanted to gain some sort of benefit from the treaty themselves. So once you think you've settled on the terms of the agreement, well, the battle's still only halfway over, because then the thing needs to be ratified in London, it needs to be ratified in Madrid, it needs to be ratified in Amsterdam, and it needs to be ratified over here by the Congress of the Confederation. So that's why it takes nearly 2 goddamn years to draft an agreement and get all the signatures of all the concerned parties. It was April of 1782 when the Paris Conference began, and the American delegation, it was a real all-star cast. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, John Jay, Henry Lawrence. So you've got 4 signers of the Declaration of Independence, you got 1 future president, you got the future first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the president of the Second Continental Congress, and hell, we would require a whole separate video to list all of Mr. Franklin's accolades and achievements. But the British? Well, they went a decidedly different route. They hadn't lost a war for several hundred years at that point, and even worse, they had lost this war to their own rebel colonists. And they were still pretty embarrassed about it, as well they should have been. So they were not going to confer any inordinate amount of dignity on these proceedings by sending the cream of the crop of British political life to negotiate this treaty. So instead, they sent a Scottish slave trader and a backbench member of Parliament, Richard Oswald and David Hartley the Younger. No peerages, no knighthoods, just a couple of dudes. And we took the additional step of sending Benjamin West, along with our delegation, the finest portrait painter in all of American history, and we gave him the assignment of painting a group picture of the 2 delegations. Except the British delegate said, nah, fuck that. We are not posing for your goddamn victory picture. You rebel assholes can go straight to hell. Which is why the painting looks like this. And it wound up quite to the detriment of the British side that they sent such a comparatively undistinguished delegation to do the negotiating, because everybody agreed, and they still agree, that the terms of the agreement wound up rather wildly favorable for the American side. The final product contained 10 articles. Number 1, Britain recognizes that the former 13 American colonies are each free, sovereign, and independent states, and that the British Crown and all its heirs and successors relinquish claims to the government, property, and territorial rights of the same and every part thereof. Number 2, the boundaries of the United States, including but not limited to the boundary between the United States and British North America, Canada to its friends, are to extend from the Mississippi River eastward to the Atlantic Ocean and southward to the limits of the southernmost former colonies. Britain surrenders any claim to its previously owned lands in the respective regions. Number 3, the United States are granted fishing rights in the Grand Banks, off the coast of Newfoundland, and in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Number 4, the United States and Great Britain agree to pay all war debts, including those incurred by Spain and the Netherlands. Yes, you heard that right. They agreed to help pay the war debts of the countries that fought against them, which is freaking crazy. Number 5, the Congress of the Confederation will earnestly recommend to the state legislatures to recognize the rightful owners of all confiscated lands and provide for the restitution of all estates, rights, and properties which have been confiscated belonging to British subjects. In other words, the United States agree that British loyalists who fled to Canada are to be compensated for whatever property they lost in doing so. Number 6, the United States will prevent future confiscations of the property of loyalists. In other words, if you still live here and you still support the British cause, our government promises not to mess with you. Number 7, prisoners of war on both sides are to be released. All British state property now in the United States is to be forfeit. Number 8, both Great Britain and the United States are to be given perpetual access to the Mississippi River. Number 9, territories captured by either side subsequent to this treaty will be returned without compensation. And number 10, ratification of the treaty is to occur within 6 months from its signing. And it actually took 8 months in the event, but such is life in the 18th century. And if you want a visual reference for what the treaty terms looked like on the ground in real life, here it is. And aside from the northern tip of what is now the state of Maine, and the northern portion of what is now the state of American Minnesota, our borders with Canada remain unchanged right up to the present day. And giving us everything east of the Mississippi was quite a generous concession on the part of the British, or a stupid concession, depending on whose side you're on, because we weren't really asserting any claim upon the lands that are currently the states of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin, but they offered it to us, so we took it. And you'll notice also that in spite of having prevailed in our struggle for independence, we are still in a rather tenuous position here. We've got British territory to the north, Spanish territory to the south, a combination of Spanish and French territory to the west. If those three great powers had decided for whatever reason to get together and attack us, we almost certainly lose that war, but fortunately it didn't come to that. The British had no more stomach for war with the Americans, and you guys could have just given us a couple seats in Parliament, and we would have been happy. That's all we wanted. We would have been perfectly fine remaining British subjects, so great job, idiots. And the French, in their zeal to damage their British enemy by dumping unconscionable amounts of money into aiding our war effort, they came so close to bankrupting themselves that it effectively became the proximate cause of the French Revolution and the consequent demise of the ancient regime. And the Spaniards, well, their colonial empire had another 120 years or so in the sun before we kicked their ass and took all the remaining possessions. Did they actually blow up the Maine? Probably not, but does it matter? Nah. They needed to get the hell out anyway. So next year, when you're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration, let's all spare a thought for the Treaty of Paris as well, shall we? I'm done, that's all I've got. Thanks for watching, see you next time. Get off my lawn.